talk about the role of rivers in Chinese history, a small case study. And it's given to my friends at Wuhan University, who I thank for this invitation. And it's a great pleasure to be with you, if only virtually, because I visited Wuhan with my wife, Sarah, several times, and it's one of the cities we really enjoy being in, with its great historic associations and its many memories. In the short time I've got, I would like to make just 3 points about the consequences of great river civilizations. And this is particularly appropriate in a talk for a meeting at Wuhan, because it is arguable that the greatest city on the greatest river in China is Wuhan, as I'll briefly point out. I'm going to confine myself to looking at 3 episodes and theories from the work of someone I've recently rediscovered, someone called Abbe, that means abbot, or leader of a monastery, Huc, H-U-C, who lived in the years 1813 to 1860. He was a Catholic missionary who spent 14 years between 1839, that's the First Opium War, and 1852, just before the Second. He wrote 6 volumes on China, including the most important in 2 volumes called The Chinese Empire, where he describes his visits to Wuhan. I hope it may be possible for you to see a map, which I'll send, of his travels, mostly with another missionary called Joseph Gabe, because they are amazing travels. He is one of the greatest travelers in history, to my mind, alongside Marco Polo and people like that. And I'm going to raise several points, and it would be very interesting if you have any comments or suggestions in relation to them. So the first point is in relation to a theory put forward several generations ago by someone called Karl Wittfogel. And it was a theory of what he called hydraulic centralization of power. Hydraulic means the control of water. And in his book, Oriental Despotism in 1957, he suggested that the need to strongly control great masses of labor in order to construct and maintain great floods and rivers led to a particular political formation, authoritarian or despotic, as he calls it. He was a Russian who had fled Russia, and he was trying to explain the power of communism in Russia. And this was meant to explain why places like Russia and China, he thought, were despotic. Well, of course, it's nonsense, because Russia is not filled with hydraulic civilizations, and they're not great water controlling as in China. But there's something true about it in relation to China, because controlling a river like the Yangtze or the Yellow River does mean that you have to work immensely closely. The government and the people have to work closely to do this. And in order to do that, you have to have very strong political control. And so the way in which Chinese civilization has developed since the earliest civilizations in the Yellow River Valley in Sichuan may indeed be affected by this need for river and water control. And the attempt to do that is very well described in the first episode. I'll read you a passage from Huc about the flooding in Chinese cities, not in Wuhan on this occasion, but in Zhejiang. He says, in 1849, we were stopped for 6 months in a Christian community of the province of Zhejiang, first by the torrents of rain that fell, and then by a general inundation over all that part of the country. It had the appearance of a vast sea, on the surface of which trees and villages were floating. The Chinese, who foresaw already the destruction of the harvest and all the horrors of famine, displayed the most remarkable industry and perseverance in struggling against the misfortune from which they were suffering. After having tried to raise dikes around their fields, they next attempted to drain off the water by which they were filled. But just when they seemed on the point of succeeding in their difficult and toilsome undertaking, the rain again came, pouring down, and their fields were once more covered. For 3 months, we witnessed their unceasing industry. Their labors were never discontinued for a moment. The unfortunate creatures standing in mud and water up to their hips were occupied day and night in working at their chain pumps in order to turn into the beds of the rivers and canals the water that were just desolating their country. The inundation could not be mastered, however, and after all their exhausting labor, the poor sufferers were compelled to abandon the cultivation of their fields and found themselves in a complete state of destitution. Then they began to assemble in great bands and wander about the province with bags on their backs, begging here and there for a little rice. They were hideous to look at, half covered with rags, their hair bristling, their features contracted, their lips livid. And these but lately peaceful and industrious peasants were evidently driven by despair to be ready for every excess. So those were the effects of this terrible flooding, which you will know of in Wuhan and the Yangtze. The second theory is taken from a famous anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, and it is actually now very popular as an idea in China more generally, the idea of involution, hard work, ever increasing hard work. And Geertz's theory in his book on Java was that the growth of population is encouraged by water. And this is very important in China. One of the most notable features of much of China is its incredibly dense population. This became a particular problem in the period of peace under the Qing, when the population of China went up 5-fold between 1650 and the time of Huck in 1850. Water and rapid population growth are connected in 2 ways. One is that the wet rice of southern China can absorb more and more labor in the process known as agricultural involution through Geertz's work. Secondly, the rivers and lakes are enormously productive of fish and ducks and also encourage trade, so you can sustain a very dense population. This is evident in Huck's description of Wuhan, which he visited. And yet, when one has not penetrated to the center of the empire, when one has not seen the great towns, Hanyang, Changfao, and Hankou, facing one another, it is impossible to form an adequate idea of the amount of the internal trade of China. Hankou especially, called the mouth of commercial markets, must be visited, for it is one great shop, and every production has its street or quarter particularly devoted to it. In all parts of the city, you meet with a concourse of passengers, often pressed so compactly together that you have the greatest difficulty to make your way through them. Long lines of porters stretch through every street, and as they proceed with a peculiar gymnastic step, they utter a measured, monotonous cry whose sharp sound is heard above all the clamors of the multitude. Huck notes that it is not just on the streets and in the markets that there is activity and a huge population, but inside the many shops and even over the waterways. And here he goes on. In seeing the streets thus constantly thronged with people, you might be apt to think that all the inhabitants of the town must be out and the houses empty. But just cast a glance into the shops and you will see they are crowded with buyers and sellers. The factories also contain a considerable number of workmen and artisans. And if to these you add the old men, women, and children, you will not be surprised to hear the population of Hankow, Hanyang, and Wuchangfo taken together is estimated at 8 million. This is 8 million in 1850. This is half the size of England at that time in one city in China. I go on. We do not know whether the inhabitants of the boats are included in this calculation, but the great port of Hankow is literally a forest of masts, and it is quite astonishing to see vessels of such a size in such numbers in the very middle of China. So that's his picture of Hankow and Wuhan. The third point I would like to make is related really to the work of the great historian of science, Joseph Needham, who pointed out how inventive and creative the Chinese were in his great work on science and civilization in China. And he doesn't make this point, but I think it's also related again to water in a way, because to deal with water and to make the most of the rivers and lakes of China, the Chinese were very creative. And one particular aspect of this, which has intrigued me, and I would very much value any comments from professors and others at Wuhan, is something he noticed, that is, Huck noticed to the south of Wuhan, but elsewhere too. This is something which you can call the floating island syndrome. Now, if you look this up in Wikipedia or somewhere like that, it doesn't even mention that this is a phenomenon in China. It's mentioned in relation to some parts of the rest of the world, but not in China. So this seems to be unknown now. But this is Huck's description of this extraordinary phenomenon. We passed several floating islands, those curious productions of Chinese ingenuity, which no other people seem ever to have thought of. These floating islands are enormous rafts, generally constructed of bamboos, which resist the decomposing influence of the water for a long time. Upon the raft is laid a tolerably thick bed of vegetable soil, and thanks to the patient labors of a few families of aquatic agriculturalists, the astonished traveler beholds a whole colony lying on the surface of the water. Pretty houses with their gardens, as well as fields and plantations of every sort. The inhabitants of these floating farms appear to enjoy peace and abundance. During the leisure time, which is not occupied by the culture of their rice fields, they employ themselves in fishing, which is at the same time a pastime and a source of profit. And often, after gathering a crop of grain from the surface of the lake, they cast their nets and bring up a harvest of fish from its depths, for these waters teem with creatures fit for the use of man. Many birds, particularly swallows and pigeons, build their nests in these floating islands and enliven the peaceful and poetic solitude. Towards the middle of the lake, we encountered one of these islands on its way to take up a fresh position. It moved very slowly, though there was a good deal of wind, and large sails were attached to the houses, as well as to each corner of the island. The inhabitants, men, women, and children, lent their strength to aid its progress by working at large oars, but their efforts did not seem materially to increase the speed at which they moved. However, these peculiar mariners do not probably trouble themselves much about delay, as they are sure of sleeping on land at whatever pace they may go. These are 3 little episodes from what is now almost entirely a buried treasure of a description of China 150 years ago. Unknown to all my Western scholar friends who are experts on China, they've never read this, and they have not noticed how important it is. I wonder whether it's better known in China. Do you, as an audience, know of the work of Abbé Huck? I imagine it must have been translated at some point. If not, I would advise you to read some of his extraordinary and sympathetic work on his investigation of China, as well as Manchuria, Mongolia, and Tibet. He spoke all these languages and he traveled through this area for 10 years. And I hope to discuss this and many other things when I have a chance with Sarah to visit one of my happiest cities, Wuhan. Thank you very much indeed.